Yeah, well, look, thanks everyone for coming. I suppose the first thing I want to do, and I hope I don't disappoint people by saying this, is that I'm not actually going to talk that much about Trotsky in this meeting. Yeah, exactly. So I was trying to get people to leave the room. Now, and the reason for that, right, is that in truth you could write 7 or 8, 9, 10, probably more different meetings about different aspects of Trotsky's life, about the different theoretical achievements that he made and so on. And I just don't have time to do that, do you know what I mean? So instead what I want to focus on is one of the most important theoretical tools that I think we get from Trotsky, and that's the theory of the United Front. What is the United Front? Well, look, I think the United Front is the method by which Marxists, ideologically the most advanced section of the working class, seek to relate to the rest of that class. Because I suppose every revolutionary is posed with an obvious question. Well, not everyone is a revolutionary, are they? And the vast majority of the time, we're in a minority. Most people hold reformist ideas. You know, they hope that capitalism can be modified, it can be tinkered with, and so on. That its excesses, war, austerity, racism, and so on, are just that. They're excesses. They can be curtailed. That they're not intrinsic to the system of capitalism, and so on, and therefore incremental change can be delivered in general through Parliament. Start off really by saying that's not something that I agree with. I think if you look at the experience of Greece, Syriza, an anti-austerity party, are elected and they're unable to prevent austerity. Why? Not because Tsipras is a nasty man, although the deportations of refugees and the continued austerity and the use of riot police and so on I think are a disgrace, but because every movement for change eventually comes up against the question of the capitalist state, that nexus of unelected bosses, bankers, civil servants and so on, whose job is the administration of capitalism. And in truth, that's their job regardless of the elected government. So, we start from Karl Marx, when he said that workers can't simply take over the existing state, in general the goal of reformist organisations like the Labour Party and so on, even though of course McDonald says that his goal is the overthrow of capitalism. He sees the way of doing that being through Parliament. Workers have to smash the state, and that this process, I think, requires organisation based on the self-activity of the working class in communities, in workplaces, strikes and demonstrations and so on, rather than in Parliament. Therefore, there is a question which I think every revolutionary has to answer, and that is, how does the revolutionary minority become the revolutionary majority? How does that most advanced section of the class, who see the need for revolution, who see the relationship between war, racism, austerity, inaction over climate change, and so on, as being intrinsically part of the system, relate to and hopefully convince the majority of society that revolution is both necessary and is possible? And the truth is that is not an easy task, certainly not easy. And I think the United Front is an essential tool in that process, where revolutionaries fight for practical unity with non-revolutionaries as part of a day-to-day struggle against the system, and in the process try and win people both to the ideas and practice of revolutionary politics, of the idea that we can have revolution. And I suppose the first example I want to give really from history about the need for a United Front is an obvious one in many senses, and that's the rise of the Nazis in the 30s, which I think is one of the most important examples of why we need unity. Just a bit of background. Global financial crisis hits in 1929, unemployment balloons in Germany, and this creates a space for the ideas of Hitler and the Nazis, and their vote grows from 2%, 2.6% in 1928 to 18.3% 2 years later. And by the end of 1931, 800,000 people are members of the Nazi Party. Midway through the following year, they get 13 million votes, 37.4% of the vote. And much is often made, I think, of Adolf Hitler's irresistible rise in the mainstream media. However, I don't think it could be further from the truth. Despite the clear threat that Nazis posed, they weren't really opposed in an organised manner. Why? After all, the Social Democratic Party, it's a mass reformist organisation, similar politically to the Labour Party in Britain, with millions of members, and the Communist Party, a revolutionary organisation with 300,000 members, clearly had the ability to stop the Nazis if they had mobilised together in workplaces, in the streets, and so on. The SPD had built a massive fighting organisation, the Reichsbanner Schwarz-Rot Gold, brought together hundreds of thousands of social democratic workers into units tasked with the armed defence of the Republic. The truth is they were never properly mobilised. The SPD leaders believed that the sanctity of the German constitution would save them from the heel of Hitler's boot. The truth is, the communists weren't much better. They too had mass organisations willing to confront the Nazis and had organised militants in workplaces willing to take action, but their strategy failed. The problem was not the willingness of Germans to fight the Nazis. Why did the SPD and the KPD, the Communist Party, fail to unite in action? During the German Revolution, which happens 15 years earlier, the SPD leadership had been crucial in curtailing the revolution and complicit in the massacre of revolutionaries, leading revolutionaries, Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht and so on, members of the Communist Party. That, alongside the fact that on the advice of the Comintern, Communist International, which at the time is essentially a body for Stalin's foreign policy, argued that communist parties had to see social democratic parties as social fascists. The SPD was to be seen as the left wing of fascism. The Nazis and the Labour Party, the SPD, were two sides of the same coin. Therefore, unity is no option. Why would you unite with them? And ultimately, the two paths of German socialism, revolutionary and reformist, led to the same place: the gas chambers, the camps. Both organisations were smashed, and as we know, millions of people were to die. But had there been an alternative to that? Leon Trotsky, one of the leading figures of the Russian Revolution, thought so, and from exile, he wrote a series of letters calling for communists to form a united front with social democrats against fascism. The threat of the fascists was such that both organisations should unite in order to oppose them. But this posed a question. Wouldn't that mean that communists were endorsing the leadership of social democracy, of the SPD, the betrayers of the revolution 15 years before? Far from it, said Trotsky. Don't argue for ideological unity with the SPD, but practical unity with all that want to fight against the fascists. And if the SPD leadership refused to fight, workers who looked to them would see that who the most serious people about fighting against fascism were, the communists. But if the SPD leaders agreed to engage in a united front against fascism, then first of all the Nazis would be pushed back, and communists would get a chance on streets, in workplaces and so on to have a discussion about how best to beat the Nazis, but also how we can fundamentally transform German society at the time. And the fight against Hitler was not the first time that Trotsky had argued for unity between revolutionaries and reformists. In August 1917, in the tumult of revolutionary Russia, an army general called Kornilov decided to march on Petrograd, which was the capital of the revolution, in order to crush that revolution. And in response, Bolsheviks called for workers and peasants, regardless of their organisation and regardless of whether they were revolutionaries or not, to unite in struggle to defend the revolution. At the same time, they argued for revolutionary solutions to the crisis in Russia, for workers' control, an end to Russia's involvement in the First World War, redistribution of land to poor peasants and so on. Crucially, however, they didn't just appeal to the base of organisations like the Mensheviks and so on, they also appealed to the leaderships. Why? After all, Kerensky had collaborated with Kornilov really since the outbreak of revolution in February in order to suppress the Bolshevik Party, and they did that really until Kerensky decided to go after Kornilov decided to go after Kerensky too. It was because of the simple fact that whilst many working class people genuinely wanted to see the revolution to its end point, they hadn't broken completely with the ideas of that reformist organisations fought for. For instance, the idea that Parliament was where change really happened, and that the Bolsheviks, and the ordinary people should wait for the government to change things on their behalf, and so on. So the Bolsheviks appealed for practical unity with the leadership and the base of the Mensheviks and other organisations of workers and peasants in Russia. They said to the leaderships, quite simply, let's fight together to defend the revolution. But if we do, you have to stop repressing us. You've got to let us print our paper, and we're probably going to criticise you on the things that we disagree on. How could they say no? If they did, workers who looked to them would see that they weren't serious about defending the revolution, and would fight alongside the Bolsheviks. So on the basis of practical unity and action, defending the revolution, they fought for ideological clarity. How could the revolution's demands not only be defended, but seen through to their logical conclusion? Not through reform, but through revolution. And it was through this process of united struggle against counter-revolution that the Bolsheviks won the trust of the majority of people in the Russian working class and a majority on the Soviets, leading to the October Revolution. Practical unity, i.e. the United Front, was a bridge towards revolutionary ideas. Then in 1921, revolutionaries sought to generalise the experience of the United Front. Why? Partly because the experience of 1917 had impressed on people like Trotsky so much, but also because the balance of class forces globally had changed, and revolutionaries were attempting to deal with how to organise in what was a completely new situation. Just to step back a second and look at context, the failure of the majority of social democratic parties to oppose the First World War in August 1917 had caused a massive crisis in the world socialist movement and led to bitter splits between those who fought for revolutionary solutions to the First World War, turn imperialist war into civil war and so on, and those who disgracefully backed their own ruling classes. And as we know, the war produced a huge social crisis. In response to the war, we saw mass strikes, mutinies, bread riots swept the continent, and for a period it looked like Europe was heading for revolution. But as we know, other than in Russia, workers failed decisively to take power. The revolutionary wave had been blocked by organisations committed to the reform of capitalism rather than its overthrow. And this posed a sharp question, I think, for revolutionaries across Europe. How do you continue to build a revolutionary organisation, as we know that it's absolutely necessary to have revolutionary organisation, in a period where revolutionary is not an immediate possibility? The split with the pro-war elements in the socialist movement in 1914 had been absolutely necessary, but in a period of relative stability and a renewed capitalist offensive, action by revolutionaries simply was not enough alone. And the revolutionary parties of the Communist International, at the time, by the way, not the Stalinised version that we come to know, but an international body of communist parties around the world, risked isolation. And this risk was made a reality when, under the influence of the ultra-left of the Comintern executive, and a frustrated layer of revolutionary workers in Germany, the German Communist Party sought to force an insurrectionary mass strike. The March action, it failed utterly. Thousands were jailed, tens of thousands were sacked, and the Communist Party lost half of its membership. Therefore, at the third Congress of the Communist International, Trotsky and Lenin sought to teach the lessons of the United Front to communists around the world. They were, in essence, that communists must win the majority of the working class, and so long as it does not hold this majority, it must fight to win it. It can only achieve this by remaining an absolutely independent organisation, ideologically and organisationally. Next, the need for a united front, despite the fact that a split is inevitable between various political organisations basing themselves on the working class, grows out of the urgent need for workers' unity in the struggle against capitalism. Communists must assume the initiative in securing unity and must seek at every given moment joint coordinated action between revolutionaries and non-revolutionaries. They should seek unity with both the leadership and the base of these organisations in order to drag reformist leaders from their asylums, as they put it, and place them alongside ourselves before the struggling masses. And on the occasion that the other leaders attempt to put the brakes on the fight back, revolutionaries should act independently, but only after fighting tooth and nail for unity. And finally, that any united front that restricts the ability of revolutionaries to act independently or to criticise reformist leaders should not be pursued. And that final point was going to become incredibly important in the years to come, with the experience of the Popular Front in France between 1934 and 1936, in a world shaped by the defeat of the revolution and the rise of Hitler and Stalin. And the truth is, I haven't got time to go into enough detail about this, but there will be a meeting by Dave Sewell on the Popular Front, I think tomorrow, that people should go to if they're more interested in it. But just so people have a brief flavour, on February the 4th, 1934, the Croix de Feu, which was a fascist organisation in France, attempted to force the government to resign. In response, there were mass strikes and demonstrations, and then in the elections of 1936, which happened in April and May, there was an electoral alliance between the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, and the party of the centre-right in France, the Radicals. They won the election easily. The Socialists won the biggest part of it, and a man called Léon Blum, who was the leader of the Socialist Party, was installed as Prime Minister. Then, as June began, something happened which nobody saw coming, which was that the slump of the 30s hit France late. Bosses went on the offensive, and in response, a huge wave of action and activity erupted across France. Millions of workers took part in action, strikes, occupations of factories and so on. People who'd never been involved in activity before became involved, and so on. The bourgeoisie was absolutely terrified, and they appealed to Blum. Blum appealed to Forez, who was the leader of the Communist Party, and Forez toured the country telling workers one must know when to end a strike. What a disgrace, effectively stopping the movement dead. So the unity of the United Front had been understood as a practical unity amongst revolutionaries and reformists over concrete demands, so that revolutionaries could win a majority amongst the working class. The Popular Front saw unity between revolutionaries, reformists, and political representatives of the bourgeoisie. Nobody's ideas were tested, and all criticism was dropped. For Trotsky, the need for a revolutionary party was the first letter of the ABC of communism, but it certainly wasn't the last. There's a quote here which I think's worth people hearing, really. Trotsky said, "It's not enough to possess the sword, one must give it an edge, and it isn't enough to give it an edge, one must know how to wield it." What did he mean? Well, he says, after separating the communists from the reformists, it is not enough to fuse the communists together simply by means of organisational discipline. It is necessary that this organisation should learn how to guide all the collective activities of the proletariat in all of its spheres of living struggle. It's quite a big ask, really, isn't it? All the collective activities of the working class in all of its spheres of trouble. And I think it's a brilliant quote, but it does underline the real difficulty of, I think, United Front work. And I suppose that's one thing that I think people should know, is that, building serious united fronts is not something which people can just pull out of their fun and so on. and that there's often a balance and compromise in truth that has to be struck in any joint activity. There's often a balance between the breadth of a movement and its radicalism. And whilst it's true that any front that restricts the actions of revolutionaries shouldn't be pursued, it's not true that this is always something that's clear-cut. Unity that can make sense at one time could be more difficult in the future and so on, and it isn't always that easy to break with people, because in general, if you say you're completely wrong and we're not going to work with you, it's quite hard to work with people again in the near future, do you know what I mean? So, Tony Cliff, the founder of the Socialist Workers Party, described the Revolutionary Party as a bridge. It's a means by which two otherwise in general isolated groups can share ideas, work together and so on. And I suppose we hope that the United Front, through our ideological clarity and practical activity, we can convince people to become revolutionaries. But the truth is, there aren't very many one-way bridges in the world. Do you know what I mean? I think there's one in Matlock that I know of. But the pull-of movements is a real thing. Do you know what I mean? Particularly if they're absolutely massive. The pressure that's put on revolutionaries to, I don't know what the verb to use really, to dilute some elements of their ideas and so on, is a real one. Because if you're trying to build a movement of millions of people, well, as we know, it isn't true that millions of people in Britain are active revolutionaries today. And I suppose what that underlines is the need for united fronts to be thought about carefully, to be constantly discussed and assessed throughout any organisation that's involved in them, really. And it also underlines, I think, the need for ideological clarity, for ideas to constantly be fought for, and as movements throw up new questions, for them to be discussed fully and so on. And different periods and different political questions often require different united fronts. So when it can be said that the SWP is involved in united front activity, and we certainly are, we often seek to apply the spirit of the united front rather than the letter of what Trotsky said. For instance, Trotsky thought that we should enter into formal agreements with different organisations. Now, I'm not against that idea, in truth, but the idea that, for instance, let's be honest, the SWP isn't a big enough organisation to write a formal letter to the entirety of the leadership of the Labour Party and say, we demand joint action on X, Y and Z. I mean, I'm not sure what Tom Watson would think about that. Actually, no, I do know what Tom Watson would think about that, do you know what I mean? I think we have to be always, quite conscientious of how we seek to apply these methods and so on. Although it does have to be said that, the Socialist Workers Party works with people like John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn in all sorts of different campaigns. For example, over the question of fighting racism and fascism, the Fast Food Rights Campaign, Blacklisting Supports Group, and so on. By the way, we would love it if Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell called for the entirety of the Labour Party to throw themselves into the July 16th demonstration, for instance, into mass activity around stand up to racism, the People's Assembly and so on. In fact, I think it'd strengthen their position against the right, both in the shape of David Cameron and in the shape of Angela Eagle. But nonetheless, why would the Labour Party, which had 60,000 people join it last week, enter into formal agreements with small organisation like ours? Don't want to overstate the extent to which the SWP is small. We're quite a large organisation, but I'm not going to deceive myself and say that we're in any position to do that. I suppose I've got 10 minutes left, is that right? So I just want to talk a little bit about some different examples of united fronts. I hope that people in the room share their experiences of the United Front, because I think it's often through working with them that we learn the most about United Front activity and that kind of thing. And then I want to talk a little bit about what I think the challenges are for us today and what we can do about it. The Anti-Nazi League is a good example. Initiated in the 1970s in response to the National Front, I suppose it was a united front between the revolutionaries, in the Socialist Workers Party, the Labour left, and different faith and community groups and so on in order to push back the National Front, and it was incredibly successful, mobilising hundreds of thousands of people against the Nazis. And Darcus Hown, famous broadcaster, says that it made a genuine impact on the level of racism that existed as his various children grew up. Do you know what I mean? I think that's something to be proud of, and we still attempt to implement that as well through organisations such as Unite Against Fascism. But interestingly, it's not true that one United Front's activity constantly stays the same. The way that Unite Against Fascism has operated has changed as the threat of fascism has changed. In the 90s and in the early 2000s, it was mainly about stopping the electoral threat of the British National Party, campaigning at the ballot box and so on. But as the English Defence League emerged, a street fighting organisation which at its height was capable of mobilising 4,000 or 5,000 people, it became a way of pulling people onto the streets to oppose them, trying to mobilise as broad a layer of people as possible, and so on. Another example is Stop the War. Again, initiated by the Socialist Workers Party, as we knew that George Bush would seek to use 9/11 to unleash American troops across the Middle East and to try and entrench US military power. Its first meeting was 2 weeks after the attacks. Who spoke, interestingly, at that rally? I was looking at an article about it. Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn said, "We won't allow George Bush to unleash terror on this world." And again, it brought together revolutionaries, the Labour left, faith organisations. I mean, even some of the Lib Dems got involved at its height, do you know what I mean? But the truth is that the politics of the movement were always shaped by revolutionaries saying, one, we oppose the war, and two, we oppose attempts to use Islamophobia to divide the movement, and so on. And the success of the Stop the War movement led to respect. An electoral coalition between the Socialist Workers Party, George Galloway, who'd just been kicked out of Labour for opposing the Iraq War, and large sections of the Muslim community in Britain. And it was an attempt to build a left of Labour political party on the back of the impact of the movement against the war. I mean, Labour had lost 5 million votes and so on. And I suppose it was a united front of a special kind in some ways. It had successes electorally. People will know that George Galloway was elected to Parliament and councillors were elected and so on. However, there's a difference between United Front activity, I think, in the run-up to elections and, United Fronts which allow us to be constantly active. And, the Socialist Workers Party put an argument that respect had to become more orientated on the general activity of the working class rather than just during elections, and had to become had to try and win workers to the idea that political representation was possible outside of the Labour Party. George Galloway disagreed with us, and for that reason we ended up having a split. And I suppose I'm not going through all of these things to say the SWP has been involved in lots of different United Front activity, but more to try and say that as the situation changes, fronts often change, and the tactics that people use and so on. And today I think we are involved in lots of organisations, Disabled People Against the Cuts, the Campaign Against Climate Change, Unite the Resistance, Unite Against Fascism, Stop the War, Stand Up to Racism, the People's Assembly, Defend Council Housing, Egypt Solidarity and so on. And by the way, if there's someone in the room from an organisation I haven't mentioned, please don't stand up and say I forgot to mention it. Just talk about what you're up to, I suppose. Do you know what I mean? Because there's lots of activity happening. And why do we involve ourselves in this process? Not because we just think it. Well, I suppose it's because we recognise the need to fight over every single question, but also because we recognise the necessity of having socialist politics at the centre of these movements. It does make a difference. When David Cameron backtracks over 3,000 child refugees being allowed into Britain, on BBC News there was an interview with a charity worker in the camp in Calais, and what? It's interesting. This woman said, really thanks David Cameron for his deference. Thank you, David, for allowing 3,000 people to leave this camp. And, on the one hand, I can understand that response, right? But that's why it's important that Stand Up to Racism call for more to be done in response to it, to turn up the pressure on the Tories after their backtrack, and for an increase in activity, because it makes a difference how people respond to the political questions thrown up by the movement and to moments where we're on the front foot and not. And, the truth is that relatively simple actions can be thrown into direct confrontations with the state and can open up very big questions. 5 minutes left. Yeah. For example, the convoy to Calais. I mean, just a show of hands, who was on the convoy at Calais? Okay, right, well look, 2 weeks ago, the People's Assembly, Stand Up to Racism, Momentum, all of the trade unions and so on, put on a mass aid convoy where we wanted to take 250 vehicles of aid to Calais, to the camp, to the jungle. We arrived at the border in Dover and we were told by French and British police that we weren't going to be allowed to cross the border because us crossing the border would aid, and I quote, the intrusion of migrants into Britain. Now, I've got to be honest with you, I've got no problem with that. You know what I mean? If they, if someone wanted to try and get back in, I think we have to deal with that question in truth. But nonetheless, a very simple act, revolutionaries and, in truth, ethical food companies were involved in it and so on, very broad, attempting to take food and clothing to people that are being left to rot by the British and French governments were stopped. Immediately the question of the state is thrown up in a way which, I've got to be honest with you, I don't think anybody that was involved in the convoy to Calais thought would happen. What did we do? We shut the port down for 2 hours, right? It was a good, brilliant moment of civil disobedience, but it doesn't answer the fundamental question. How do you stop refugees being left to drown and so on, and how do you get refugees out of Calais and into Britain? Because the truth is, the crisis of the refugee crisis isn't going away, and what a disgrace it is. What an absolute disgrace that in a world where David Cameron and the rest of his buddies can hide trillions of pounds in Panama, we don't have the resources or the money to help refugees and so on. I mean, there are 600,000 empty homes in Britain, and I suppose what it underlines, though, is the importance of us building organisations like Stand Up to Racism, which is a broad campaign which is able to respond, I think, to all the various manifestations of racism today, defending free movement, the refugee crisis, challenging prevent agenda and Islamophobia, responding to police brutality in the States and so on. But Stand Up to Racism alone doesn't answer all of the political questions that I think we have to answer in the current period. Austerity has to be stopped as well, do you know what I mean? And I think we all know about the relationship between people's services being cut and divide and rule from the ruling classes and so on. Therefore, if you want to deal with the question of racism, I think you have to deal with the question of why society's resources are being cut, and if you want to deal with that, you have to address the question of austerity. And because of that, I think the People's Assembly is another vital tool for any activists that are fighting in Britain today. Because the truth is, well, look, I think that we need more of a focus on organising against the cuts in the workplaces as well as on the streets. But nonetheless, the People's Assembly is incredible. If you think about the demonstration which took place on April 16th, it involved people from across the organised British movement. And when I say that, I don't just mean like the Labour movement. The Woodcraft folk are there with banners. The Green Party were there with banners. Momentum mobilised for it in a serious way. They put on coaches and so on. And in many ways, I think the People's Assembly shows both the breadth of the movement, but contains all of the people who are being radicalised by years of war and austerity and so on. And I suppose at the centre of both of these movements, though, we need socialist politics. We need a layer of people willing to fight both tooth and nail for the biggest level of mobilisation possible on the 16th and in general, but also who fight for an understanding of how we can get a world which goes past the questions that are thrown up by the movement. How do we open the borders? How can we stop austerity? How can we force action over climate change? And I think that the politics of revolutionary socialism and the method of the United Front can help us to answer those questions and to win a majority of society to engage with, develop and argue for for that change, another world is possible, isn't it? And God, don't we need it?
Right then, yeah. So I'm in the United Front. It's a community traveller organisation, association, and I've got two questions about the operation of the United Front and that is always troubling me when I'm, being active in that. The first thing is that well, there's, the argument of being as broad as possible, and we had that argument, and I'm all for it to a certain degree. However, the people I had in my organisation were arguing that we needed to keep broad. We had to deal with crime to our community, or to deal with so-called problem people. That would have then broadened it. However, I argued that we needed to be a united fighting force against being cleared off from where we live, and that to be the main thing, and not to deal with those other things. So, in one sense, we actually became a smaller group than we could have been, and more militant. However, when it came to the point when we were under a great attack, as we are now, those arguments helped in the ability, rather than actually dealing with all these different things that weren't, I think, that important, we're able to deal with things that were important. And so it worked out now. But the thing is my question is, how do you get the balance between the broadest, right, and to argue or act in the right way to dealing with something? I mean, you can relate that to any other United Front. Do you lose some of your? How much politics do you lose to keep in a united group, right? And I know there might not be a formula, but at least there's some sort of thing to point us towards. The other thing is, my understanding, the United Front is about a working class organisation, united of working class organisations, right? Or from the working class. And a popular front is when you're working with people from different classes, to a certain degree, to be crude about it. Now, my organisation has got artisans, self-employed, and petits bourgeoisie even. Mainly workers, but them as well. So my question also, the other question is, at what point does a United Front become a popular front? But yeah.
Thank you. Cheers.
Tom mentioned July the 16th demonstration, which Stand Up to Racism was called the People's Assembly. I think, given the post-referendum numerous attacks of various kinds on individuals, on Polish community centres and so on, that really is a key date in the diary for anyone who can go, because it will be the first, or one of the first main occasions really, where people, whatever way they voted in the referendum, for instance, and there's been fallout, of course, people attacking people who voted Leave, for instance, and so we won't work with you again. Now, hopefully that's just social media spats, frankly, because some of that stuff is A, it's unnecessary, and B, it's a complete disaster, because we know where it can lead. So July the 16th is a key date, and certainly at the Stand Up to Racism /UAF office, there's been a number of people contacted ourselves about what they can do for the demonstration. A number of people volunteering, a number of people scared, frankly, in some instances of the fact that many racists are confident. They feel they can come out openly now and say stuff that they couldn't have said even a few weeks ago, and being given a platform for it. And I'll always remember, to my dying day, is a example of where you get if you get the United Front wrong, where it ends up. Tom mentioned the concentration camps in Auschwitz. There's Hearst, one of the commandants of the concentration camp for a period of time, jokingly refers to in his memoirs, which are partly there, SPD prisoners arriving a few days after KPD prisoners arriving, and he jokes about in the memoirs, in the glass panels, they can have a chat now about where their differing views have led. Right, that's how. I'm not saying these are such times in the present period, but there's the ultimate disaster. That's where it can lead. The other thing I want to say quickly is really there's an argument going on in the anti-fascist world, as people will know, in this country and elsewhere, essentially around substitutionalism, in my opinion. Some people who call themselves Antifa and that, I don't think know the history actually. Some people who call themselves Antifa, not the decent people that there are in Antifa, but some people in Antifa may not know it. Antifa was a creation of the KPD, the Communist Party in Germany in the early 30s, and some individuals in the KPD did try to reach out to the SPD supporters and the SPD as a wider organisation. As was said, the Comintern Stalinist politics stopped that. It stopped that completely and disastrously, as we know, so that the very, very brave people in Antifa and the SPD, there was no, as was said, there was no formal organisation. I think we see that to some extent now with the autonomist arguments.
Thanks, Comrade.
Oh, right.
Aye. 3 minutes, so just finish your point.
All right. Essentially this, that for all the limitations, for all the faults, for all the problems with them, you have to base yourselves on and be independent of at the same time, which is tricky, the mass organisations of workers, i.e. the trade unions, amongst others.
Cheers.
Just wanted to say a bit about what Marcus, the speaker before last, said, really, because I think in terms of the difference between the Popular Front and the United Front, because as he said, in terms of the Popular Front is basically an alliance between the working class and the middle class and even sections of the capitalist class, allegedly progressive, but which inevitably means that the interests of the workers suffer. And obviously, Tom referred to the 1936 in France, and the Popular Front led to the Communist Party trying to calling off the mass movement of factory occupations because they didn't want to upset their relationship with the radicals, the sort of left wing of the capitalists. So the interests of workers to fight back, push the factory operations much further in a revolutionary direction were basically sold out because the Communist Party that was grew massively during that year used its influence in the class to hold back the struggle so not to upset the Popular Front, where a united front is unity of all workers in struggle against the bosses. That's putting it very crudely, but obviously in terms of what that means today, like Tom said, we're not in the SWP we're not a mass organisation, so what we're talking about really is applying the method of that today. And I think I had my best personal experience I've been involved in of the United. So applying the method of what Trotsky talked about and the spirit of it, not literally what he was talking about, because in Trotsky's day he was talking about the unity of mass organisations. We're sort of unfortunately a lot of the time talking about working with other people to our right on a local basis. I mean, where I live in Walthamstow 3 years ago, we had the EDL coming to town. And we had to, there was huge anger about it, and through Uniting Against Fascism, we were trying to organise the biggest possible opposition on the streets to see off the EDL, to stop them coming. And it was complicated because we had the local MP, a local Labour MP, a highly untrustworthy individual who, to be fair, was opposed to the EDL but wanted a ban. And on the other hand, inside the We Are Walthamstow that we organised, we had the Socialist Party who was saying, well, we can't work with anybody that supports cuts in the local council, i.e. trying to. So we had this kind of balance between, keeping the local MP on board, which was obviously important in terms of helping us build a mass organisation, but didn't mean we agreed with her politics, and didn't mean, and obviously opposing a ban, because that would demobilise the movement and actually allow the EDL to come if we went along with some police ban. On the other hand, we had to argue with the SP, who was trying to narrow the movement down to people that basically signing to say we oppose cuts in the council. Of course we're opposed to cuts in the council, but the crucial thing was mobilising the biggest number of people in action against the EDL, and I think we were able to win that argument. We increased our sort of support and influence as the SWP recruited some of the leading people, and crucially we got 4,000 people on the streets that basically humiliated the EDL. So I think it's complicated, but it's it's a concrete issue.
Cheers.
Hi, I'm Nicola Field, Southwark SWP. I just wanted to talk a little bit about this constant fluidity and the changing challenges working in the United Front, and the threat of sort of dissolving our revolutionary principles and so on into the movements that we involve ourselves in. just sort of really aware that people come into political activity, you know, and into movements such as refugee solidarity and so on, out of a sense of moral outrage, political and moral outrage, and they bring that. You know, if we manage to recruit those people, that's the kind of key factor that has brought people into political activity. I mean, I sort of, when I came into the SWP in 1990, it was through the poll tax riots, and you know, again, it was a sense of complete outrage against the injustice of the poll tax. And I'd come through the gay movement of the 80s. That was an outrage against people dying. We knew they were dying unnecessarily because of the capitalist system. And it was a sense of outrage, a sense of panic, a sense of time being very short, and a sense of humanitarian, you know, like humanitarian catastrophe. And I think that's, for me, you know, being involved in a group called LGBT Against Islamophobia, I'm seeing this happening again, that people are getting involved. They are outraged against the right-wing shifts of the gay movement, the commercialisation, the lack of class politics, the lack of opposition to racism and so on. So getting involved in LGBT Against Islamophobia is a fantastic channel for that frustration. But of course, and we've recruited people through that, building that movement. And we are very much in the throes of needing to think how we're going to make sure that those people who've joined our organisation through that impetus of moral outrage and political frustration are going to be able to, you know, kind of develop politically through that process and not get dissolved. And it's a constant sort of battle within yourself and the people around you, and how you're going to not only support those new recruits to the SWP to help them develop politically, but also not let yourself get kind of pulled and dissolved into it as well, because that's always there. And, you know, there's all sorts of threats that take place, that, you know, dealing with dealing with sectarians, you know, being, we're constantly undermined by other people in the movement who you know, are wanting to undermine the SWP, and these things, new recruits are having to deal with that all the time. And it's just about our absolute the necessity for supporting all of us. I'm not just talking about the experienced comrades supporting inexperienced comrades. I'm saying we have to do it for ourselves constantly. Thank you.
I'm sure you'll get a lot more experience from them of our activities and their talk tomorrow afternoon with Brid and Richard Boyd Barrett, just to mention that, because I'm not going to talk about that. I think there's no argument about the United Front and how we use it, but my experience over the last, Jesus Christ, 40, 50 years, since the days of the anti-Vietnam War movement, right, so that goes that far back, is that yes, we get the activity, we get these organisations going, but quite often we fail to translate the politics of why we did it, what the outcome is, and to update younger people who come into our organisation and into the movement with what the consequences were of failure. You know, we're in the just very briefly, in the anti-Vietnam War movement, way back in the 60s, I'm alongside an American Air Force Master Sergeant, right, in a bowling alley in the east of England. And he'd done 2 terms, and he was on his 2nd term. He came back off it. He said, I don't know what and I won't use the language, we were doing there. We cannot achieve anything. We failed. It's a partial that we cannot win. And I was talking about how we were involved in the anti-Vietnam War campaign. I understand. We can't, obviously, as an enlisted soldier. You know, he couldn't do anything. But you could understand the argument. Please tell people why it fails. That's what we're really talking about. So every time we have that, the Anti-Nazi League, bring it forward all the way through the 60s, the 80s, we need to show what happened and explain why things didn't spread the way we wanted it to. We're still a tiny bloody organisation.
Thank you.
And I want to share our experience with, I guess, United Front of Coalition work. We had a garbage crisis in the summer. I'm not sure if you've heard about it. Waste management crisis, garbage filled the streets of Beirut and pretty much the entire country, which sparked a lot of popular mobilization and riots in the city. And what we decided to do at the time was join larger groups, other groups of people who are around our socialist forum, namely feminist organizations and environmentalists and independents. And one of the issues I wanted to bring up, because I think this is a matter of context for us, is that in Lebanon we have a problem of non-organizing. There are no political organizations, in fact. I mean, there's the Communist Party, the large sectarian parties, there's small parties such as ours, but extremely limited, but most individuals act on an individual basis outside of political organizing or political parties, or within collectives, cooperatives, non-political organizations that don't take a political stand. And what we've been really working on over the last period is working on organizing, on getting people to organize, either by joining us if they'd like, and if not, by supporting them and forming their own organizations, even if they hold a critical position towards our own politics. But what we were able to do, though, just to give a bit of an idea of how the dynamics or the structure of the garbage crisis movement, is that it's culminated in three large organizations, one that represented the Communist Party, one that came from the Nationalists, and the organization or coalition we were part of, which was much smaller, so had much less of a say. And decisions were taken in a coordination committee behind closed doors within NGOs by pretty much old men who just screamed at each other for 5 hours every single evening, and reached no real momentum or ability to move the movement forward. So we had to go and win our political positions in the streets instead of in the coordination committees, because we had no voice or no say inside these meetings anyways. And we were part of a very successful campaign that was called Patriarchy is a Killer, like Nizam al-Abawi Qatl, that stirred a lot of issues and served in politicizing the issue of garbage further, so that it's not just about waste management, it's not just about corruption in the ruling class, it is also issues of sexism, issues of sexual harassment, and these things were happening within the movement itself. But what I wanted to pose to the room and sort of see if we can share experience on this is the question of internal mechanisms for decision making, because this is something we are debating and struggling a lot with. How do we make decisions with other groups or collectives, especially in our situation when we organize with a lot of individuals instead of organizations?
Thank you.
When you read Trotsky on the United Front, particularly in the writings about Germany, it seems so bloody obvious that he was right. Whenever you read it, and you can, even if you read it 10 times, read it again. It's wonderful what he writes. You think this is such a strong argument. Why didn't he win it? And one reason is we need to think about the situation. He was arguing for joint activity with the leadership of the SPD, the Labour-type party in Germany, a party which, yes, just over a decade before, had murdered Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, which has an effect on a party. One would think if we were arguing for unity with an organisation that had murdered leaders of our own party, that there would be a bit of uncertainty about that. The second thing is it didn't stop with Luxemburg and Liebknecht. For one of the May Day demonstrations, for example, in Berlin, revolutionaries were murdered by the police, unleashed by the SPD. They killed them on the streets. And the other reason was they were a big party. They had hundreds of thousands of members, they had millions of voters. Now the point about this is Trotsky was arguing this was necessary even in that situation. Even in that situation where you have a big revolutionary component, a great deal of working class support, and the people with whom you are arguing for unity in action are people who have betrayed you in the most brutal manner, killed you and stopped a revolution. So we should learn one thing from that: revolutionaries should never be scared of the United Front. We should never run away from the fact that is the only method, yes, by which revolutionaries can get bigger, but also the working class can gain, is through United Front activity. You see, you can never say, we want a United Front with you so that we can grow bigger and smash you ideologically. This is not a great method of saying why you want a United Front. No, the reason why we want a United Front is because the working class requires unity. in order to get better wages, to stop the fascists, to put back racism, to take action over climate change and so on. And therefore, you know, for all the difficulties, and there are manifold difficulties about it, manifold difficulties. Politics is not simply a science, it also has elements of art inside it. There are difficulties and we require argument and discussion and debate all the time about it. In the beginning is the deed. Action is the key question. And therefore I think, you know, one of the central divides between popular frontism and united frontism is about action. Does it put people on the streets? Under what slogans does it do so? And by doing so, does it raise the consciousness and the belief of working class in their own ability to change the world?
I'd like to begin by speaking of the Popular Front process in France.
En tant que front électoral réformiste confronté au mouvement de la classe ouvrière.
As an electoral and reformist front confronted to the working class movement.
Pour cela, il faut remonter effectivement aux épisodes de février 1934.
And this is understandable if you know the events of February 1934.
Les ligues fascistes tentent d'attaquer le Parlement le 6 février.
Fascist group tried to attack the parliament on February the 6th.
Ces ligues étaient principalement composées de la petite bourgeoisie et d'anciens combattants qui étaient animés de tous par l'antisémitisme.
They were mainly composed of former soldiers and middle class people who were all anti-Semitic.
La gauche de la social-démocratie a alors tenté d'alerter le Parti communiste.
The left of the Social Democracy tried to alert the Communist Party
pour tenter une réponse unitaire.
To buy the unitary response.
Le Parti communiste, par sectarisme, préférait les traités de social-fascistes.
The Communist Party, by sectarism, preferred to call them social-fascists.
3 jours après l'attaque des ligues, Moscou ordonne au PC de réagir tout seul.
3 days after the fascist attack, Moscow told the Communist Party to make a sectarian and only response.
Et ils vont manifester le 9 tout seul et 6 ouvriers vont mourir.
And they will demonstrate February the 9th and the 6th.
Ouais.
6 workers will be killed by the police.
Lorsqu'ils rejoignent après donc le 9, ils changent de stratégie pour organiser une manifestation unitaire avec la social-démocratie.
So after these events, the Communist Party decide to change its strategy and they organize a demonstration with the Social Democracy.
Et là, lorsque les deux cortèges se rejoignent, du PC et de la social-démocratie, la base de ces organisations crie unité.
And when the Communist Party and the Social Democracy Party will join in the demonstration, the activists of this party will shout unity.
Le front électoral, le Front populaire comme front électoral commence ici avec un programme minimal, la paix, du travail et du pain.
The Popular Front as an electoral front will begin at this moment with a very small program which is peace, bread and work.
Yeah. Une fois la victoire électorale atteinte, la classe ouvrière, elle ne veut pas attendre.
Once they won the election, the working class don't want to wait.
Durant le mois de mai-juin 1936, on connaît en France 9000 usines occupées et 5 millions de travailleurs qui entrent en grève.
During May and June 1936, in France there are about 9,000 factories occupied by the workers and 5 million workers on strike.
Il faudra des accords avec des victoires réelles pour la classe ouvrière et le discours de Maurice Thorez pour mettre fin à cette grève.
And finally, the working class will have a real gain in this movement. And Thorez, the leader of the Communist Party, will say now we stop the strike.
Maintenant, malgré la crise que connaissent les organisations réformistes en France,
now in France, despite the crisis that is met by the reformist organization.
Incapable de prendre des initiatives contre l'islamophobie et le Front National.
Who don't take any initiatives against the National Front or against Islamophobia.
Nous devons continuer à développer la stratégie du Front unique.
We must go on developing the United Front strategy.
Je vais finir par un exemple.
I will conclude on one example.
Durant la mobilisation en France, la mobilisation étudiante,
during the mobilization we know in France now, the student mobilization,
les organisations anticapitalistes ont contacté toutes les organisations étudiantes pour organiser un front unitaire.
Anti-capitalist organizations decided to organize a big united front with all the students organizations.
Et nous avons mis en place des assemblées générales permettant l'autonomie politique des étudiants.
We built a general assembly in order to allow the political autonomy of the students.
Et 4 mois plus tard, les cortèges étudiants créaient A anticapitaliste.
And 4 months later, the students cortège, in the student demonstrations, the main slogan was A anti-capitalist.
Hey. Thank you everybody that contributed, and I'm going to ask Tom now just to maybe sum up at the end, and there's still plenty, it's just the beginning of Marxism, so please discuss further, go to further meetings, ask more questions. So Tom.
Right, okay. Yeah, thanks for that. I think it's really useful hearing people share their examples, and thanks for talking about the Popular Front in a way which I didn't have time to do it, and yeah, what's happening in France at the moment is incredible. I suppose I really want to make two points really. The first one is about kind of what Marcus said about the balance between breadth and radicalism, because obviously I think everyone in this room, right, will have heard of Stand Up to Racism at this point, or at least I hope so, because I mentioned it a number of times, so it's a bit of a test really. No, because obviously it's been involved in mass demonstrations, 100,000 people on September the 12th and 20,000 people on March the 19th and so on. What people often don't realise though is that when the news first broke that mass drownings were beginning in the Mediterranean at the start of the year, Stand Up to Racism called a vigil outside Downing Street which had 12 people on it. One of them was Diane Abbott, by the way, but nonetheless there was 12 people at that event. Why is that important? Because sometimes what it requires is for people to put a hard argument in order to forge greater unity in the future. I mean, Stand Up to Racism has existed for 2 or 3 years now. It emerged initially as a way of attempting to respond to anti-migrant racism and increasing Islamophobia, and after the break of the refugee crisis, it tried to take that on and frame the refugee crisis within a context of racism and so on. But that wasn't an easy process. 3 years ago, when Stand Up to Racism called a demonstration, there were 2,000 people on it. The year after, there was 8,000. This year, there was 20. Why is that important? Not to say, oh, fantastic, Stand Up to Racism is growing, although it is growing. I think it has to grow further, has to become a genuine social movement in Britain, which everybody can be involved in some way, shape or form in activity. But really it's to say that it took a hard argument. It took socialists to say, we need a broad organisation which can respond to the different manifestations of racism in order for us to be able to challenge racism effectively. And, lots of people didn't agree with that. And the truth is that the pressure around those arguments still exists. It's also a good example is LGBT against Islamophobia. I think, in truth, the United Front, which has become a lot more useful than it expected to in many ways, do you know what I mean? When LGBT against Islamophobia was set up, it was set up in response to the way in which some sections of the pink establishment, if you can call it that, particularly around elements of pink media and so on, were making concessions to the argument that homophobia was somehow racialised. How useful it was to have that organisation in the aftermath of Orlando, where we printed 250, 300 copies of a statement, took it to the vigil at Orlando, at Soho, and in 20 minutes got rid of all of them. The truth is, if we'd had 1,000, it probably would have got rid of those in 20 minutes as well, do you know what I mean? But the important thing, again, was about a layer of socialists and revolutionaries working with a broader section of people and saying that we are going to put an argument into this moment. And I think, whilst it isn't true that lots of people will have gone to that with Islamophobic ideas, actually the vast majority of people rejected it. Seeing an organisation with a banner and with a statement entrenches those ideas and gives people confidence, and I think that's a hugely important thing, and I'm very thankful to comrades for building that, because I think, you know, the truth is the ruling class are going to attempt to use the question of oppression to divide us further. The second point I want to make is 4 minutes, okay. It's about the question of Corbyn in the state, really, because it is absolutely undoubted that the election of Jeremy Corbyn has opened up huge possibilities for everybody on the radical left. You know, a rising tide raises all ships, doesn't it? Do you know what I mean? And, you know, I think Corbyn in many ways is a reflection of the social movements that he's been involved in and can act as an accelerator for them. But there's a contradiction, isn't there? And there's a difficulty, which is that if your orientation for political change is based on Parliament, then you are hamstrung if 172 of your MPs decide to try and pass a motion of no confidence in you and attempt to get rid of you. I don't know if people have seen, by the way, just as an interesting aside, angelaforleader.org was registered 4 days before the referendum. This is something which has been planned, do you know what I mean? I don't know if you're... Yeah, Angela, Charlie, be careful, Angela's asked for it, you know, no. But nonetheless, right, it raises an important thing. On Monday, Momentum, for the first time, called for a demonstration against the attacks of the Labour right. It's the first time that Momentum have called something which involved on the front foot activity against the Labour right, rather than internal electoral work and stuff in the CLPs and so on. 10,000 people showed up. It was a huge show of solidarity with Jeremy Corbyn, and I think gave massive levels of confidence to people. But it raises a broader question about orientation, because if your orientation is on taking over Parliament, then the truth is votes matter. And you saw the pressure of that when John McDonnell, I think wrongly, made concessions to the argument around free movement of labour in the EU referendum. I think if you have a different type of orientation, an orientation on the idea that ordinary people, through their objective condition, through the fact that we have to work alongside each other in order to survive, and that we are at the centre of production in society and making society work, then it allows you to challenge the arguments of around free movement, make no concessions, because racism divides working class people and so on, but it also shows you a way that we can change things. And I'll end on this. I talked about the convoy to Calais earlier. It's interesting. I think there could be lots of different responses to the convoy to Calais. But imagine if workers from the RMT, the Rail, Maritime and Transport Union, said that we're going to take a boat to Calais. And when we get to Calais, we're going to take cars to the jungle. And we're going to get people in the cars, we're going to drive onto the ferry, and we're going to bring them here. What would the ruling class be able to do? It would petrify them. Why? Because it shows the amount of power that workers have. And I'm not saying that the RMT, by the way, are about to do this. I'd love it if they did. But I think that's the way that we can genuinely resolve the refugee crisis, is about working class people saying that we can be part of tearing down these borders and dismantling the camp. But if you want that to be the case, then your orientation has to be on how does that happen? Not through Parliament, but through workers' self-organisation and confidence. And I suppose what that means is that you have to be part of a revolutionary organisation which attempts to mobilise that kind of activity and so on. And, you know, Trotsky talked about needing a sword. The good thing is that swords already exist. The Socialist Workers Party is a revolutionary organisation. Now, I'd like to think we've got a sharp edge. You know, Marxism is partly about people engaging with our ideas and helping to sharpen the arguments and so on. There's always a question about how you wield a sword, but that's something which everyone should be involved in. So I suppose I'd say to people, if you agree with how Marxism has gone so far, and you agree with the arguments that we've made in this meeting about the levers for change and so on, then you should think about joining our organisation, because we need big movements in society for change, but we need hard revolutionaries at the centre of them, willing to argue about how we can change the world. Anything is possible, but it doesn't mean that it's easy.